Today's video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations. We often say, only time will tell when we're trying to analyze moves by the world's powers and predict how those moves will play out. What would happen if China attacked Taiwan? Would Japan really do enough to deter such an attack? How would the USA react? But do you ever wish you could do more than active speculation? Well, today's sponsor is Conflict of Nations, and this video game allows you to do just that. It's a real-time tactical combat game, so you can choose which country you want to lead in a modern global war scenario and engage in combat with up to 128 other players in real time, in games that can take weeks to complete. Once you have an account, you can play it on mobile or on PC. I like how it uses modern warfare technology and logistics. It really lets you play around with conflicts from the last couple of decades, or even situations that could kick off in the world today. Even better, if you click on the link in the description, you can unlock your exclusive gift of 13,000 units of gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. This offer is only available for 30 days, so check it out today. After decades and decades, hundreds of years of slumber, the Chinese giant has finally woken up. Over the past 4 decades, economic growth has averaged around 10% per year. During these years, China has transformed from a rural society of poor farmers to a modern industrial country with large metropolises. Inflation-adjusted GDP per capita increased 24-fold. Average life expectancy increased by more than 10 years, and more than 700 million people left poverty behind, according to World Bank data. And in fact, in 2020, the World Bank published new estimates that already put the Chinese economy ahead of the US economy when the GDP is adjusted for the difference in the cost of living. And it is not just the World Bank. IMF estimates point in exactly the same direction. Even the coronavirus somehow seems like an example of the success and superiority of the Chinese model. While Xi Jinping's government managed to quickly contain the pandemic and close 2020 with good economic data, the experience, not only in the United States, but in most developed countries, was very different. The fact is that, according to surveys, all these changes have made a large majority of people believe that China will soon surpass the United States as the world's #1 superpower, which is not particularly surprising. Think about it for a moment. In the collective imagination, the Chinese produce everything. They manufacture everything. They are practically becoming the masters of half the world. And what do you want me to say? Apparently, the data seems clear. China has a higher adjusted GDP, higher levels of investment, higher trade flows, and its economic growth is higher. Get ready for it, Yankees. In fact, the Chinese are the second largest owners of US debt after Japan. Now, wait a minute. Let's put the brakes on a second. Does all this mean that we are doomed to Chinese hegemony? That the country of the 3 kingdoms will surely become the great superpower of the world? That the United States' time of being the #1 economic and military superpower is finished? Well, pay attention, because with China, things are not always what they seem. So what exactly does the data say? Listen up.
The Dragon Economy.
The first thing we could say is that the Chinese data should be taken with a grain of salt, because it might not be entirely reliable. It is something that we've already talked about here on VisualPolitik. But believe me, whether the data is more or less accurate, this is the least of the problems in assessing whether or not China will surpass the United States. After all, it is undeniable that over the last 40 years, the country has experienced enormous growth and development. There is no doubt about that. Just take a look at its huge skyscrapers, its modern infrastructure, its booming middle class, or the new Chinese companies like Alibaba or Tencent that are stretching their tentacles all over the world. Now, this is far from the whole story. The truth is that the United States is still much richer than China. More importantly, the gap, far from narrowing, is getting wider and wider. Well, wait, stop, wait a minute. Are you kidding? Are you saying that there is a growing gap between US and China? But didn't we say that China's adjusted GDP has already surpassed that of the US? Well, yes, but the problem is that GDP is a gross indicator that does not measure costs or wealth generation well, nor does it measure the margin a country has to become a superpower. Do you want an example? Well, take a look. Since 2000, the percentage of millionaires relative to the population as a whole has increased in China by just half a point, while in the United States, the increase has been 10 times greater. Today, nearly 9% of American adults have a net worth of more than $1 million. In fact, according to Credit Suisse data, the wealth gap between Americans and Chinese has widened since 2011 by more than $12 trillion. How is this possible? Isn't China the factory of the world? Yes, that's true, but the problem is that it's a very inefficient factory. China produces a lot, which pushes its GDP so high. But in order to do so, it runs up a huge production cost. That is, the Chinese economy is large, but terribly inefficient. And no, I'm not referring to wages, but to the consumption of inputs such as energy, water, raw materials, or even the number of workers needed to perform a task. In addition, a very significant chunk of China's production is consumed in satisfying the basic needs of its 1.4 billion inhabitants and also of the Chinese government itself. And the problem is that GDP measures annual production in gross terms, let's say, but it does not take into account costs or the surplus that eventually becomes wealth. And it is precisely there where the trap lies. And it is also what explains why, for example, a country as impoverished as India has the 5th highest GDP in the world, despite the fact that it barely has the resources to act as a superpower and the vast majority of its population is very poor. Conclusion: be careful with the data you used. But let's not get sidetracked. I know what you're wondering. Just how inefficient is the Chinese economy? And why on earth is it so inefficient? Well, you see, China's economic growth can be explained almost entirely by the growth of productive resources. Now let me explain that. Between 90 and 97% of Chinese economic growth has been linked to the incorporation of more workers and the investment in physical capital. In contrast, what is called total factor productivity has accounted for only 3 to 7% of the expansion of China's economy. And you may ask, why is this so important? Because this productivity is what allows you to do more with less. Let's take an example. Imagine that we have 2 factories with the same production, but the first one has 1 machine and 1 worker, while the second one has 2 workers and 2 machines. Evidently, the first factory is much more efficient, more productive. It manages to do more with less, in such a way that on the one hand, it requires investing less capital and therefore accumulating less debt, and on the other hand, it leaves productive factors available, a machine and a worker, to be able to set up other businesses. See the difference? Well, that is exactly what is happening in the case of China. As productivity is very low, in order to maintain economic growth, the government has had to invest huge amounts of money, which has multiplied the debt. To give you an idea, between 2007 and 2017, China's non-financial debt has multiplied by 4 times, which is a larger increase than any other country. And in fact, it has already surpassed the average of advanced economies. It's a factor that helps explain headlines like this one.
Evergrande and the end of China's build model, valued at $41 billion in 2020. The spectacular unraveling of the property group exposes deep flaws in Beijing's growth strategy.
And let's not kid ourselves, as this trend cannot be sustained permanently, and overinvestment has generated a lot of surplus production everywhere. Factories that are not needed, ghost cities, and rising costs throughout the economy. Think, for example, of interest rates, higher energy costs, higher wages due to less available workers, and so on and so forth. Chinese growth has been slowing down in recent years. And the point is that, unlike China, the United States has a much more efficient economy, and its companies are among the most competitive in the world. The result is that its productivity per worker is not only much higher than in China, but also that the difference is getting greater and greater. What's more, with just a quarter of the population, the United States' welfare and internal security costs are far lower than China's. China is a country that, despite its smaller production, has to feed, clothe, and heat many more people, which means the surplus production, that is the accumulation of wealth, is much smaller. The result, China is growing, but the United States is getting richer and richer. And obviously, the richer you are, the more capabilities you have to maintain your superpower status. Do things look a little different now? Well, wait a minute, because we've only actually just begun. According to World Bank and United Nations estimates, human capital, that is education, skills, and experience, accounts for more than half of the wealth of most countries and up to 80% of the wealth of the most developed nations. And this is just one of the United States' great strengths. For example, in China, just over 10% of the workforce has a university degree, compared to 44% of the US workforce. What's more, the quality of American universities is far, far superior, which is understandable, because in China, there is not even free access to the internet, or to scientific research from the rest of the world. As a result, whilst the best Chinese university appears in 58th place in the Center for World University Rankings, the United States has 29 of the 50 best universities in the world. And no, the other rankings are not very different. To make matters worse, worse. Every year, China loses hundreds of thousands of well-trained workers to work abroad, including tens of thousands of engineers, scientists, inventors, and entrepreneurs. The United States, on the other hand, receives 1 million foreign workers every year, among them thousands of scientists and engineers from all over the world, including China itself. In other words, the United States has a better squad, a better academy, and on top of that, every year they make better use of the transfer market. This is partly what explains the higher productivity levels. The United States has largely specialized in high value added and technologically advanced products that are very difficult for China to replicate. In fact, one thing that is not factored in is that out of every dollar of Chinese production exported to the United States, 55 cents are components and services produced in the United States itself. In addition, Xi Jinping's increasing meddling in private companies. There is the war unleashed against the country's large private technology corporations, for example, is unlikely to help productivity increase in the future either. The same goes for corruption, or the obstacles that the Communist Party imposes on all those entrepreneurs who do not belong to their party. And we still have one last, and not exactly minor problem: demographics. China is aging much faster than the United States, and its population over 65 will more than triple by mid-century. As you can see, the evolution of the two countries is very different. The Asian giant has a huge problem with pensions. The population is going to shrink sharply over the next few decades, and the higher proportion of people over 65 means that the country will have to take resources out of production in order to care for them. So basically, no. As much as Xi Jinping does not like it, it does not seem that China's economic power will surpass that of the United States in the coming decades, nor that the Asian country will have enough resources to fight for the #1 spot as the world's preeminent superpower. It's the data, plain and simple. The data! The data! But be careful, because it's not just about the economy. Something very similar is also happening with the armed forces. Listen up.
The Dragon's Sword.
In a future video, we will tell you how China's military strategy is essentially about becoming a major regional power. Because the truth is that, at the moment, the differences at a global level are enormous. For example, US military spending is about 3 times that of China. And yes, it is true that Chinese soldiers are paid much less, but it is also true that the Chinese army has 1.2 million more soldiers than that of the United States. The result is that the Chinese armed forces have to pay a lot of salaries, a lot of living costs, and a lot more pensions. This is a gigantic burden. For example, it is estimated that since 2008, rising personnel costs have eaten up more than half of the increases in China's military budget. And of course, nowadays, the number of troops is far from being synonymous with military capability, quite the contrary. What counts is having a well-equipped, well-trained, and logistically sound army. And you know what? The United States is a winner there. The figures are so overwhelming that it is not making any comparison. On top of that, the Chinese army has no combat experience either, and its training is much poorer. Among other reasons, Chinese troops spend about 20% of their time studying communist ideology of the Chinese government and attending political rallies. And while it's true that China is making great strides in military technology, we'll be talking about that here on VisualPolitik soon, so don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. The gap with the United States is still galactic. To make matters worse, China's borders are a huge drain on its armed forces. Why? Well, because it does not get along particularly well with most of its neighbors, which forces it to have a large part of its army scattered all over the country. Specifically, the Chinese army devotes almost half of its armed forces to border control and internal security, a totally different scenario to that of the United States, whose army is almost entirely built to expand its force all around the world. And one last point, neighbors and allies. China has become the great regional power in the Asia-Pacific, but its influence is not as overwhelming as we might think at first glance. For example, the Chinese Navy is the most powerful in the region, but it only represents around 30% of the naval tonnage in the area. The efforts of South Korea, Japan, India, Taiwan, Australia, and Vietnam, among many others, make the competition more fierce than it seems, particularly because most of these countries are not only not China's allies, but are also allies of the United States. In fact, the United States has been securing military alliances alliances with more and more countries. Yes, in diplomatic matters, the United States is also far ahead. The future is unwritten, and China has certainly become a superpower and a country with enormous influence. But the truth is that, as the data stands today, it suggests that it is still far behind the United States. And what is even more important, everything points to the fact that the gap is not only not closing, but may even be widening. I'm sorry for all of those who do not like American dominance, but in terms of economic and military capacity, I think we can safely say that the United States will be around for a long time. But having got this far, it's your turn. How do you think the economic and military competition between these two powers will develop? Are you one of those who believe that China will eventually surpass the United States? Leave us your comments below, and let's get the debate started. Remember that if you want to engage in epic battles and fight for world domination, the free online PvP strategy game, Conflict of Nations, is waiting for you. Choose your country, design your strategy, and fight your way to victory. Click on the link in the description to get your free gold and 1 month of premium membership, but remember that this offer is only available for the next 30 days. And don't forget to subscribe to VisualPolitik, even if you are a Xi Jinping fan. Thank you very much for being there. All the best, and I'll see you next time. I'm gonna go play this game now. Yeah. Come on, United Kingdom. You can do it.